You might call Joanne Hush a social pioneer. It's probably not a label she would ascribe to herself, but Joanne is the mother of a gay son and a lesbian daughter, both of whom came out to her and her husband Paul decades ago in the 1980s and early 90s, when having openly gay or lesbian children was far more controversial and uncommon than it is today. Joanne learned her son was gay in the late 1980s at the peak of the AIDS epidemic. Back then, there wasn't a good public understanding of how the disease is transmitted. There was, however, widespread fear and stigma associated with AIDS, factors that Joanne, her husband, and their two straight children had to deal with. There was also the challenge that Joanne and her husband faced in coming out themselves as the parents of gay children. Where could they go for help, support, and information? It was long before the internet had emerged as the information clearinghouse on such issues that it is today. As Joanne tells PFLAG's Rick Kuntz in this moving interview, it was through her involvement with PFLAG Cape Cod, beginning in the mid-1990s, that Joanne and her husband found a community of support and encouragement among other parents of gays, lesbians, and transgender youth. Our story might not seem very revolutionary today, says Joanne, but 30 or 35 years ago, things were quite different, she says. I'm so glad we found PFLAG Cape Cod because it helped my husband and me to fully embrace our two gay children and to love them for who they truly are. Joanne, it's so good to be with you today. I'm so interested in your story, hearing you tell it for our podcast listeners about being the mother of two gay children. What I'd like to begin, I think, with is by asking you to talk about what you would hope that other parents of gay children, what they would take away from this interview and what you have to share with them about what you've learned about being the parent of gay children.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure for me to be part of the PFLAG podcast series. My older child, my son, who is gay, came out in the late 80s. And it was right in the midst of the AIDS crisis in the United States. And a really terrifying time for the entire country, but particularly for people who were gay and certainly the parents of a young man who was gay. So I would say that, for the last few years, I've felt that I probably haven't had a story to tell because my experience is with a gay son and a lesbian daughter and goes back so many years, so that now, and I thank the good heavens for this, having a gay son or a lesbian daughter is nothing to even blink an eye at. It's just become an accepted part of our society, as it should be, at least in many parts of the country, and here on Cape Cod, certainly where I live. But in giving it deeper thought, why I see that back in the 80s particularly, when my son came out and the AIDS epidemic was raging, it was terrifying in the same way that a mother and father today might find out that their child is transgender, because the acceptance of a transgender child today is a very difficult thing in many circles. So I do have something to say, I think. And as far as that experience with my son is concerned, I've gone back over that time more carefully since we talked last. And I had told you, and this was true of both of my children, my daughter did come out in the 90s, and it was not traumatic in any way for any of us. But when my son came out, it was a total surprise. I know everyone says parents should know, but believe me, I just hadn't occurred to me. And in both of my children's cases, why they chose to come out after they had graduated from college. And I say that because things are quite different now, and children will come out at much earlier stages of their schooling and their lives. And so for my husband and me, in many cases, we were spared the anguish of worrying about our children while they were in middle school or high school, when their peers can be very cruel. And it was in college that, at least this is what they've told me, that they really came to terms with their sexuality and felt comfortable enough with it to then let their parents know. So when Jim told me, it was a phone call, believe it or not. He was on his way to the West Coast, and he was going to be stopping at home first, coming down from Boston. He had gone to Boston University, and he wanted to warn us, I guess, that this was going to be coming. So we had a chance to think about it and think about our response. And I'm always grateful when I look back on that, because it spared me from saying anything negative that I might have said, like, oh, you'll get over it, or I can't imagine what I might have said. But fortunately, we just were gracious and loving, and yes, we're looking forward to seeing you. But what was going through my mind was, of course, the fear of him being ill, and who knew what his lifestyle had been. Oh, he did assure us on the phone, though, that he had had an HIV test and that he was healthy. So that was a relief. But back in those days, even though the Psychiatric Association of America had changed their diagnosis, so-called, of gay people in the late 70s, I tell you, in the mid-80s, I was still feeling that it had to be my fault, that had to be the mother's fault, that somehow I had been dominating or whatever, and destroyed their sexual lives. So that was a terrible burden. And then the other was the social outcast feeling of it for my children, and then the social pressure on myself. And I knew that in order to relieve that, I would have to come out myself. And so in those few remaining working years with my friends in Connecticut, my close friends, I did take them into my confidence.
Yes. Yes, and it's easy for us to forget, I think, that back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of concern about AIDS. I'm sure that as parents, it was top of mind for you. And there was also such a stigma, such a social stigma associated with that, right?
Absolutely. And fear.
Fear.
So, it was, I suppose, not unlike COVID today. As hard as that is to imagine, it was a totally different kind of viral infection, but there was fear from the general public that it could just be easily passed along.
I remember when Princess Diana began to destigmatize AIDS.
Yes.
By helping the public to understand that it was not communicable through the air, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she would touch AIDS patients and be loving and kind.
I think it was at about this point, but correct me if I'm wrong or clarify for me. It was at about this time, was it not, that you and your husband Paul discovered your church's support of the LGBTQ community and its and PFLAG Cape Cod as well, right?
That's exactly right. We retired, really early retirement. We had been in a hospitality business in Connecticut that grew and grew like Topsy and was totally exhausting. We had had a house in Brewster for, decades. Our children had grown up there in the summertime, and we always hoped it would be our retirement home, and indeed it was. So in about 94, 93, 94, we did retire to Brewster. And I would say within a year or so, had discovered First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church in Brewster and started attending services there. And it was there, actually, the very first service that we went to, where two women who were lesbians were being celebrated for their, what did they call it? It wasn't a marriage ceremony, a commitment.
Ceremony.
Yes, a commitment ceremony. And the minister was up on the podium with them, and they were all, the entire congregation was so joyful. And my husband and I looked at each other and said, we cannot believe we're in church. And so that clinched it for us, that a church that would be that welcoming was exactly where we wanted to be. And in looking at the Sunday bulletin, I saw that they sponsored PFLAG meetings monthly in their church building, their recreational building. And I started going to that. And there I just learned so much. And from the other parents, and mainly it was a comfort level that I achieved with myself and with the idea of my children being gay that has only gotten stronger.
Yes. And can you remember those early meetings and how you were feeling at the time? Because you and your husband, Paul, were supportive of Jim and then later your daughter, Katie. What were the feelings that you had nonetheless?
I would say the major feeling that I can bring to that, and it permeated our lives, our social lives, was the complete ease that we felt with having gay children and being able to celebrate them in all aspects of our life, and have friends in when they were there, have them meet all of our new friends. It was wonderful, wonderful feeling.
And this coming out process that you spoke of, I think it's so true for parents and families of LGBTQ individuals. How long did it take, do you recall, for that coming out process, that process of becoming comfortable? How long did it take you and Paul?
Well, of course, I don't know for Paul specifically. We never really discussed it that way. But it never seemed any different for him, so I can't believe that it was a greater or lesser problem. I bet it was 3 years.
Okay.
And I say 3 years after I joined PFLAG. So that means that we had 5 or 6 years, maybe it was 10 years altogether, because it took me now. To be fair to myself, there wasn't as much material that was available, nor did I have the social opportunities. When I say we were working hard in our hospitality, I mean it was just that. There was very little time for anything else. But once we came up here and started to live what I would say a comfortable well-balanced life, it probably was about 3 years.
Hmm.
And I can almost pinpoint that because the minister asked me and a gay man, he and I had become friends in the church, to do a dual service. And I was, of course, terrified, but also I agreed to do it and tell my story.
Wow.
I know from the pulpit, as did he, and I can't imagine I could have done that in earlier years.
Wow. So you stood up and basically shared your
Right.
coming out story and that of Jim's.
Exactly. Right.
Yes. And you know, Joanne, I have to ask you, you and Paul seem to have taken the news of what Jim shared and then later what Katie shared. You took it pretty much in stride. And do you have any thoughts as to why it is so hard for other parents nowadays, but back then, for parents of a gay or lesbian child to accept that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there is tremendous pressure from religious background, and it's very, very sad. But people who are strongly religious, particularly in the Christian religion, I think just truly believe, in talking to friends, this is my understanding, that the soul of their child is at stake. And I don't know if you really believe that, and it's fervent, and I'm not questioning that. I've seen it. It's, I guess, a genuine concern.
Yes, yes. And what's your advice to other parents of LGBTQ individuals today in terms of how they can educate themselves? Certainly, getting involved in groups like PFLAG Cape Cod can be of help, right?
Right, absolutely. And they have such good, reliable materials to read and to learn from. And just going to their meetings, they are purely support groups, which means that the other parents there are parents who have experienced having a gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender child, and how they have coped, worried, come through, are happy. All these are so very helpful and calming, I think, just helpful. And then, of course, there's the internet. My gosh, we can learn so much from the internet today.
Yes, and in fact, that's it's by virtue of the internet that we're doing this podcast interview today, isn't it?
That's right.
And and I think one of the biggest concerns that many parents of LGBTQ youth have is a concern that the children will live normal and happy lives.
Yes.
And I know you've told me that Jim has a partner. They have a set of life, and Katie has a wife, right?
Yes. Well, actually, Jim has a husband.
Yes.
Bob and he married. They waited because Bob's family perhaps is a bit more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And he is from Reno, Nevada, and the fifth of a family of 5 boys.
Oh, wow.
I know. And so the other 4 older boys had all married, had families, stayed right in the same community. And so in that way, it is certainly a close-knit family, but an old-fashioned family, I call it, in that everyone has stayed right there. And Bob moved away, went to college away, and met Jim when he had graduated from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. So the two of them have been together for a long, long time, but it was Bob's feeling that until it was that same-sex marriage was the law of the land, he didn't feel comfortable marrying and having his whole family be a part of it. So they waited and just were married after DOMA was fine.
After it became legal to do so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Defense of Marriage Act, I think it was finally the Supreme
repealed.
Court, yes, put it down. And so they've been married for a lesser time. The girls were married on Cape Cod, and that was exciting for all of us.
Well, I'm sure you have experience with and can offer advice to families who learn of LGBTQ members. And what was it like for you and for your family interacting and getting to know Bob's family and then Katie's wife's family as well? How does that work?
Well, of course, Bob's family is so far away that we've met them. Actually, Jim and Bob got us together years ago. They live in San Diego, but they had a weekend house or a vacation house that they would rent out from time to time, but also save it for themselves in Palm Springs. And so they invited his parents and us for a long weekend. And I think they had gotten tickets for Indian Wells tennis. So they made sure we had a lot to do.
Yes.
Not sure how much we had in common.
Yeah.
And we all clicked. We had a wonderful time.
Wonderful.
And there was no sense at all on my part that they were judgmental, or I think they just embraced Jim right from the beginning.
Yes.
And Katie's situation is really kind of funny because Katie and Carol, her wife, live in Brooklyn, met in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And Carol is Puerto Rican and was totally raised in Brooklyn. She knows it inside out. And her mother is a single mother, speaks English not very well. And so we got together a lot because, of course, when we were in Connecticut, Brooklyn was a hop, skip, and a jump. Sure. And we would go down and visit the girls frequently. And Carol's mother, Irma, would join us. We'd go to the theater or Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. And she was so warm and welcoming. And so the funny story is before they actually had their wedding ceremony, now Katie and Carol had been together, I'm going to say, for maybe 4 years before they were married. Carol said, well, I better come out to my mother. She never had. And so Carol sat her mother down and I have something to tell you. And her mother's response was, well, I knew Katie was gay, but I didn't think you were. I should say that Katie has always been a tomboy, and so kind of butch as the lingo goes. And so I just thought that was hilarious.
It's wonderful to hear you share these stories. And when you think about other families that are dealing with these issues, and and you've acquired so much wisdom around working through feelings and acceptance and all of this. What's your advice to the families and friends of LGBTQ people who are maybe struggling at times with accepting this kind of information?
Oh my, I would say that the best thing is to bring it out and discuss it. And I don't know who you discuss it with. It would depend upon your own situation, but somebody who knows about it and can be a listener while you talk. Maybe a therapist who is trained in LGBTQ issues.
It's kind of if someone is confronting this, it's really important that they seek more information and that they also learn that they're not alone and they don't need to be alone with this information.
Exactly. And isn't that where PFLAG comes in, Rick?
It really does.
Yeah.
It helps us to know that we're not alone and that there are others out there with whom we can relate. Well, Joanne, this is wonderful. Is there anything I have not asked you about that you think would be of interest to our podcast listeners that's come up as we've been talking here?
Well, I would say that perhaps the cherry on the top for me has been that my long relationship with PFLAG over all these years has brought me so close to my own children, and there's a comfort level there with their sexuality that I'm not sure would have been achieved otherwise. And mainly it's their pride in where I've put my efforts. So that makes me very happy.
Well, I think you've shared wonderful stories and experience and wisdom here today. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Well, you are welcome, and thank you. It's been a pleasure, Rick.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.